But for now, with 2022 seemingly close to done, or I mean, 19 commitments. Uh, you figure it's going to end up in the 25 ish range. Let's talk about where it stands and where it can get to. Right now, it's the number two class in the country, still more than 500 points behind Ohio State and rivals ranking system. Just a little bit ahead of Penn State now. Penn State being the number three team, about 20 points ahead of them. So, Mike, just given that you've done a mock class and just where some of these other uncommitted targets stand, where do you think the ceiling is for this thing?
I want to say real quick, it's just so funny to me, like the game within the game of, college football recruiting. That like these recruiting rankings is its own, just interesting battle, right? I mean, talking about 500, points behind Ohio State in a rankings formula. I really do feel like the recruiting battles is like its own sport for us to enjoy in the off season. But you mentioned around 25. That is kind of what I'm expecting. Now, per the Rivals formula, it takes into account your top 20 players. So once Notre Dame gets its next commitment, it's going to add less points when they have new commitments after that. Unless, if Notre Dame gets a 2-star commitment, it adds no points. But if they go get a 4-star player who's ranked inside the top 100, then his points would subtract, or Amarion Walker, who's the lowest commit right now in the class with a 5.5 recruit ranking, his points would subtract against that the new commitments. So then I don't even know if that's any making sense. But basically the new commitments, there's a little math formula that goes on to insert them now into the top 20, if that makes sense. I'm sure Patrick could explain that better than I could. But I do think it'll be around 25 to 26, maybe 24. So kind of in that range. But that's what we're seeing right now in July. If you ask me again in December, I could say, oh, it's 21. Or no, it's 30. Like you just don't know. But as far as Notre Dame, can they finish up in the top 5? To answer that, Patrick, you got to look at who's not in the top 5 right now, right?
Exactly. And anyone who, if you're watching on YouTube here, you'll see noticeable absence of multiple recent national champions from that top 5, mainly just due to having a smaller class right now.
Yeah.
And at some point on signing day, everybody ends up with a commit floor of, I don't know, especially now in this era of more players leaving. What would you figure? 20? And yeah, Alabama, Clemson down at 10 and 16 right now. Georgia, they're at 11. Usually see them in the top 5 when it's all said and done. None of those 3 have more than 11 players. So, and we've talked a ton on here about how like really judging a class is a long game over the course of a cycle. Well, right now you look at Alabama or Clemson or Georgia's and think, unremarkable, or they're struggling. It could just be where a lot of their targets or even guys that are leading their way just haven't announced yet. And you also at this point think they're gonna get some dudes, and to where you just expect them to push their way up the rankings whenever that happens, even if it's just a lot of guys who are planning to take this thing the distance that they still end up with anyway.
I think.
So.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's even if Notre Dame, hits on a lot of its guys and does well the rest of the cycle. There's that aspect too of just how those teams catch up, and do they catch up enough to perhaps just leapfrog Notre Dame more than it would be Notre Dame falling per se.
So let's say Notre Dame just kind of just goes on a roll and hits on all their top guys. If they get C.J. Williams, number 29 player in the country, Tobias Merriweather, I believe he's like 150 or 160 player overall. If they go get Zach Rice, and go get Cyrus Moss, and he probably wouldn't get also Hero Kanu, but if they just get one of those other defensive linemen that's ranked a 4-star, Kanu Moss or Anthony Lucas, and get Xavier Nwankpa. Now we're talking about, I think, potentially they get some of those names, I think it's potentially 3, two, maybe in that 2 to 4 range. But if they kind of, or Billy Strauss, another highly ranked offensive lineman, but if they, kind of hit on like, 30-ish% of those names, I think it'll be maybe right around. It's so hard to guess right now. I'm just throwing crap against the wall, but maybe in the 5 to 7 range, which would be really good if you look at history of Notre Dame recruiting in the Rivals era, and then even more specifically Brian Kelly era. So I think it's safe to say that Ohio State will have a place in the top 5. Um, I think it's safe to say Alabama will. It's probably even safe to say Clemson, even though they traditionally don't have a ton of top 5 classes on Rivals. I think partly because they will have some smaller classes. LSU is right there. Look at that. 2 5-stars and 9 4-stars for podcast audience. So you got Ohio State 1, Notre Dame 2, Penn State 3, LSU 4, Florida State 5. But you look at Oklahoma at 6, Oregon 7, 15 commitments, 16 commitments. So there's, they have a pretty high ceiling there. I think one thing Notre Dame definitely could use is a 5-star player or two. Jalen Sneed is committed to the Irish. I think he's got a decent chance of getting bumped up to 5-star status. And then can they get a Zach Rice? Could they get a CJ Williams? And maybe he ends up a 5-star, or, being the number 29 overall player in the country is definitely going to give the Irish some good bonus points in the rankings. So some things to keep an eye on. It's going to be tough for Notre Dame to stay in the top 5, but the ceiling is definitely there.
If you made me guess right now, when we look at the final standings on February, whatever exact date, late signing period is, if Notre Dame is in the top 5, I would guess no, just because of the leapfrog potential of some of those teams that you mentioned that usually end up finishing there and do well with guys at the end of the cycle. But if you made me guess whether it finishes as the second best class of the Kelly era, I would say absolutely.
Yeah.
And to get into that top 5, I think Nick Singleton, landing him would have really helped that. Of course, you can make up for that per se with a surprise land from, instead of getting one of Hero Canoe and Moss and Wampa or Zach Rice or something, you get a couple of those guys, which maybe you didn't foresee earlier. That would, I guess, kind of negate that, I don't want to say expected land, but someone who was realistic to land. And then a bump from one of its internal guys to a 5-star, or into the top 100 or something like that. Jalen Sneed, like you said, seemingly being the best candidate for that. So that would, if Notre Dame can pull a surprise land of, say, Zach Rice and Wampa, Cyrus Moss, like one of those 3 guys, or even, I don't want to say Hero Canoe because maybe that means no Lucas or Moss or something.
Right.
But say one of those 3 top 100s and Sneed gets bumped to 5-star status, then I think there's a real chance at it. Just getting the floor up high enough to not be leapfrogged by enough teams.
And yeah, I think it'll also help, if other guys also get bumped. Like look at some of the lower ranked guys in the class, like an Amarion Walker. If he gets a bump, from a 5.5 to, who knows, maybe a 5.8, and then your floor of your class is a little bit better. So you definitely don't want the lowest ranked guy in your top 20 to be like a 5.5. You would ideally want it to be a 5.8, but it would probably, for Notre Dame's case, probably be a 5.7, which is that high 3-star designation per Rivals.
Yeah, and you get Rivals 250 bonus points. Say Devin Moore, Benjamin Morrison ends up in there.
Sure.
Not as substantial a boost as, say, getting Sneed to a 5-star bump would be, but something that would just be another variable in trying to help them get there.